Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we're going to do the second half of Leninism or Trotskyism by Lev Kamenev from 1924. If you haven't listened to the first half of this file yet, please go back and do that. It also contains some background and historical context. Right now we're going to pick it up in section 1.3, the war period, referring to World War I. Then came the war, rightly designated by Lenin as an event of world historical importance in the life of humanity, and as the greatest test of international socialism, rendering apparent the impassable chasm between opportunism and revolutionary communism. The moment came when everyone had to show their colors. The moment came when all vacillation had to cease once and for all, and when a definite end had to be put to what Lenin termed inferior diplomacy, the diplomacy of having one foot in each camp. But did this really come about? Did the war induce Comrade Trotsky to break once and for all with opportunism and support of the right, and to renounce the role of defender and disguise for the Mensheviks, in which role he had been exposed for 10 years by Comrade Lenin? Since the time when Comrade Trotsky entered our party, serving it well, and thereby adding many glorious pages to the history of his own life, and to the history of the party, we have not considered it possible to enter into this question. But when he takes it upon himself to falsify the history and the ideas of Bolshevism, when he attempts to appropriate to himself the ideology of the party, when he endeavors to supplant Leninism by Trotskyism in the ideology of the Russian and international proletariat, then he himself forces us to put this question. Did the war actually separate Trotsky from the opportunists? Did the inferior diplomacy cease in the face of these great events? Not at all. Just as Comrade Trotsky contrived to combine an arch-revolutionary, quote, left phrase with cooperation with the Mensheviks in 1905, in the same manner, he managed to combine his internationalism during the war with the support of opportunism. 1915. As early as the summer of 1915, Lenin wrote as follows, quote, "In a reactionary war, the revolutionary class is bound to desire the defeat of its government. This is an axiom, contested only by the conscious adherents or unskilled assistants of social democracy. Trotsky belongs to these last. Trotsky, who as usual does not agree in principle with the Social Democrats on any single question, coincides with them in every question in actual practice. Martov and Trotsky are anxious to combine the Platonic defense of internationalism with the unconditional demand for unity with the Nasha Zarya, with the Organization Committee, Central Committee of the Mensheviks, or with the Chikaidze fraction." Unquote. At the end of 1915, Lenin wrote, quote, "In reality, Trotsky is supporting the liberal politicians of Russia, who, by their disavowal of the role played by the peasantry, really mean that they do not wish to raise the peasantry to revolution." Unquote. And again, quote, "Trotsky and the company of foreign flunkies of opportunism are doing their utmost to patch up the differences, and to save the opportunism of the Nasha group by the defense and praise of the Chikaidze fraction." Unquote. 1916. At the beginning of 1916, quote, "The powerless diplomatists and such preachers of compromise as Kautsky in Germany, Longuet in France, and Martov in Russia are most harmful to the labor movement, for they defend the fiction of unity, and thus prevent the real and matured alliance of the opposition of all countries, the founding of the Third International." Unquote. In March 1916, quote, "And Trotsky, he is entirely in favor of the right of self-determination, but for him this is merely an empty phrase, since he does not demand separation of the nation oppressed by the fatherland of the socialists in any given case. He preserves silence on the hypocrisy of Kautsky and his followers." Unquote. In October 1916, just 12 months before our October, quote, "However good the intentions of Martov and Trotsky may be subjectively, they are nonetheless aiding Russian social imperialism by their complaisance." Unquote. In December 1916, quote, "As early as the year 1902, Hobson recognized not only the significance of the United States of Europe, Kautsky's disciple, Trotsky may take cognizance of this, but also the significance of a fact which the sanctimonious followers of Kautsky in every country are anxious to conceal, that the opportunists or social chauvinists are cooperating with the imperialist bourgeoisie for the creation of an imperialist Europe supported on the shoulders of Asia and Africa. One of the conclusions which we have drawn from this is the necessity of separation from social chauvinism." Unquote. 1917. On 17th February 1917, that late, quote, "The name of Trotsky signifies left phraseology and block with the right against the aim of the left." Unquote. 6 weeks after the anti-Tsarist February Revolution, on the 7th of March 1917, Lenin wrote, quote, "In my opinion, the matter of the greatest importance at the present juncture is not foolish attempts at a coming to an understanding on the lines projected by Trotsky and Company with the social patriots or with the even more dangerous elements of the organization committee type, Mensheviks, but to continue the work of our party in a logical international spirit," unquote. There is one important point which must not be omitted here. During the whole of this period, Comrade Trotsky was a decided adversary of the so-called Zimmerwald left, whose leader was Lenin, and which formed the germ of the Third International. The Third International was born not only of the struggle against Scheidemann, van der Velde, and their like, it originated and grew in strength at the same time in the struggle against the Zimmerwald Center, against Kautsky and Trotsky. The practical policy of this center was as follows: no final rupture with the Second International, no founding of the Third International, the aim striven for by Lenin as head of the Zimmerwald left. Lenin never altered his characterization and opinion of the line taken by Comrade Trotsky, either at the time when the tide of revolution was at its highest or at the time of its lowest ebb. No Leninist taking the name seriously can admit even the thought that Comrade Lenin, in thus systematically revealing Comrade Trotsky's standpoint for so many years in succession, was influenced by any individual motives. In his systematic and impassioned fight against Trotskyism, Comrade Lenin was solely influenced by the fact that he saw in Trotskyism a certain current hostile to the ideology and the organization of the Bolshevist Party, a current which in actual practice served the ends of Menshevism. As Comrade Lenin would say, it is comparatively easy to combat Menshevism for its open and consistent anti-proletarian character, obviously liberal in essentials, is at once comprehended by only slightly experienced workers, and is thus rejected by the workers. It is more needful to combat the concealed forms of Menshevism, those forms which clothe opportunist policy in left revolutionary phraseology, the form which adapts Menshevism to the revolutionary feelings of the masses. Those who fight against us with open visor are not our sole enemies. We have another foe in that group which disguises the efforts of open enemies by means of revolutionary phrases, and furthers the cause of the enemies of the party by exploiting the confidence felt in these phrases. Lenin merely formulated the relations to Trotskyism, characteristic for the whole Bolshevist party, although Comrade Trotsky succeeded at times, in especially difficult moments in the life of the party, in drawing some few Bolsheviks over to him, if only for a brief period, by means of his phrases and inferior diplomacy. Section 2. Comrade Trotsky enters the party. The above-described relations between Bolshevism and Trotskyism were characterized by Comrade Trotsky himself in the words, quote, "I came to Lenin fighting." This phrase not only evidences a desire to win approbation, but it is very well expressed. Comrade Trotsky is a master of elegant phraseology, but the matter in question is unfortunately much too serious in character to be settled by a well-turned sentence. In the first place, this phrase is not strictly accurate, and in the second place, it is calculated to carry away the reader by its beauty and to conceal Comrade Trotsky's real thoughts. This elegant phrase is a piece of hypocrisy. Is it then really true that the whole history of Trotsky's attitude, as we have followed it here from 1903 to 1907, can be characterized by these words of his, "I came to Lenin fighting"? Trotsky is apparently extremely satisfied with the history of his relations to Bolshevism. At least he wrote in his book, The New Course, which appeared a few months ago, quote, "I do not consider that the road by which I reached Lenin is any less suitable or certain than other roads," unquote. For Trotsky, this is very reassuring. But is it possible for the party, without deceiving itself, to regard the road upon which Trotsky reached our party as suitable and certain? If this road really was a road to Lenin, then every one-time Menshevik and social revolutionist, of whom there are not few in our party, can make use of Trotsky's words and declare, quote, "In reality I was not a Menshevik or social revolutionist, I was merely making my way, fighting, to Bolshevism," unquote. One thing at least is evident: the party cannot recommend anybody to take Trotsky's road to Bolshevism. The comrades who have come over to us from other parties have generally declared that they have been mistaken, that they have had a different conception of the interests of the working class, and had thought to serve these interests in a different manner, but that they are now convinced that they have been on the wrong road. The party did not demand any such avowal from Comrade Trotsky, and was quite right in not doing so. Comrade Trotsky stood the test, and stood it excellently. But this does not by any means signify that the party can permit Comrade Trotsky to designate his 15 years of fighting against Bolshevism and Lenin as a suitable and sure path to Leninism. I maintain that Trotsky sees the road by which he approached Lenin from an entirely opposite standpoint to ours, that he does not believe Bolshevism to have been proved right and Trotskyism wrong. Trotsky came to the party with the conviction not that he was going to learn anything from Bolshevism, but that he was going to teach the party Trotskyism and substitute Leninism by Trotskyism. In Trotsky's book, War and Revolution, we read, quote, "There were 3 points in which the newspaper Nasze Slovo, Trotsky's organ, had not yet arrived at an agreement with the Social Democrat, the organ of the CC of the Bolsheviks, conducted by Lenin and Zinoviev, even after the former had finally passed into the hands of the left wing of the editorial staff. These points referred to defeatism, to the struggle for peace, and to the character of the approaching Russian revolutions. Nasze Slovo rejected defeatism," Kamenev adds, which Lenin had held from the beginning of the war to be the fundamental principle of really revolutionary internationalism. Continuing, "The Social Democrat rejected the slogan of the struggle for peace and opposed it by the slogan of civil war," added by Kamenev, rejected by Trotsky. Nasze Slovo finally supported the view that it must be made the task of our party to conquer power in the name of socialist revolution. The Social Democrat maintained the standpoint of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, unquote. A few lines before Trotsky informs us that the, quote, "differences existing between the Social Democrat and the Nasze Slovo, considerable at first, quote, had diminished," unquote. Not only Trotsky, but Martov was at one time a member of the editorial staff of the Nasze Slovo. Martov, however, resigned his post later on account of the remorseless criticism exercised by Comrade Lenin and of the increase of revolutionary communist elements among the editors. After the paper had finally passed into the hands of the left wing of the editorial staff, that is, into Trotsky's hands, these 3 points of dispute remained: the question of defeatism, the question of civil war or peace, and the question of the character of the impending Russian Revolution. Lenin stood for the defeat of the national bourgeoisie. He impressed upon the workers the necessity of the defeat of their, quote, "own bourgeoisie." Trotsky was opposed to this. Lenin stood for civil war. Trotsky opposed it. Lenin stood for the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Trotsky opposed it. Here, as Lenin pointed out, he caused great confusion with his left phrase on permanent revolution. In this last point, Trotsky gave the impression of being more left than Lenin. He was not content with the mere dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, but demanded permanent revolution. Here we have merely a further example of what Lenin impressed upon us for so many years with regard to Trotsky: a right policy with regard to daily questions of actual practice, but skillfully disguised in the phraseology of the left. A fourth difference must, however, be added to these 3, one not mentioned by Comrade Trotsky: the difference in the question of the Second and Third Internationals. Lenin, at the head of the Zimmerwald left, stood for immediate rupture with the Second International and with Kautsky, and for the founding of the Third International. Trotsky and the pro-Kautsky Center were against this. But only a few months after the existence of these differences had been definitely ascertained, Trotsky joined the Bolshevist Party. Quote, "The March Revolution," he writes, "has wiped out all these differences," unquote. Truly, all of them? And how? Trotsky doesn't say. Yet the party has a right to put this question, since Comrade Trotsky has obliged us to occupy ourselves with his history. Are we to understand the declaration that the revolution has erased all differences in such manner that we may assume Comrade Trotsky to have become convinced of his having been mistaken on all these important points, that he has adopted the viewpoint of the Bolsheviks? Comrade Martinov, one of the best of the Menshevist theoreticians, declared candidly, quote, "I have served the working class for 30 years in the way which I held to be the best. Today I see that I have been in the wrong. History confirms the correctness of Lenin's standpoint with regard to the Russian Revolution, and I join Lenin," unquote. But Comrade Trotsky has given the party no such answer. Trotsky on himself and Leninism. Trotsky, in his book 1905, writes as follows, quote, "In the period between the 9th of January and the strike in October 1905, I formed those views of the character of the revolutionary development in Russia which have received the designation of permanent revolution. Despite the interval of 12 years, this estimate has been fully confirmed," unquote. This was written in the year 1922. But during the whole of these 12 years, this theory was opposed by another theory, Lenin's theory expressed in the formula, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Quote, "This idea," so wrote Comrade Trotsky in 1918, and wrote it again in 1922, without the slightest reservation, quote, "This idea has been repeated unwearyingly by Lenin since 1904, but that does not make it correct," unquote. In this book, 1905, Trotsky describes Lenin's fundamental idea as an empty abstraction, and writes that the Bolsheviks, quote, "arrive at the idea of a bourgeois democratic self-limitation of the proletariat possessing state power," unquote. He continues, quote, "Whilst the anti-revolutionary features of Menshevism are already visible to their full extent, the anti-revolutionary features of Bolshevism threatened to appear as a mighty danger only in the case of a revolutionary victory, unquote. Comrade Trotsky, who caused this phrase on the dangers of the anti-revolutionary features of Bolshevism to be republished and confirmed in the year of 1922, adds the following quote, "As is already well known, this did not happen, for Bolshevism, under Comrade Lenin's leadership, changed its ideological equipment in this most important question in the spring of 1917, that is, before the conquest of power," unquote. Trotsky's idea is now clear. The standpoint held by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party on the character of the revolution, as developed between 1904 and the spring of 1917, had not only been wrong, but even counter-revolutionary with respect to the socialist revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were thus obliged to, quote, change their equipment in the spring of 1917, before the conquest of power, for the purpose of accomplishing the conquest of power. That is, they found themselves obliged to substitute the counter-revolutionary equipment of Bolshevism by the really revolutionary equipment which Trotsky had kept ready on hand for 12 years. It is Trotsky's conviction that Lenin came over to Trotsky after first building up the party for 15 years on, quote, anti-revolutionary ideas. Trotsky has proved to be in the right during the whole course of his intellectual conflicts with Bolshevism and with Lenin up to the year 1917. That is the import of all of Trotsky's latest books, 1905 and 1917. But if this is so, then we must state it openly. If Bolshevism contains anti-revolutionary features, if we have to change our equipment before a decisive battle, then what right have we to teach uncorrected Bolshevism to our proletariat and to the proletariats of all countries? Why do we not say anywhere, not in one single textbook read by the proletariat of our country and of the whole world, comrades, we teach you Bolshevism, but don't forget that Bolshevism contains anti-revolutionary features, and as soon as the fight begins, then you will not be able to manage it with the equipment of Bolshevism, but will have to replace it by another, the equipment of Trotskyism. We must either teach Bolshevism, Leninism, as it is, without correction, as the real theory of proletarian revolution, or if there is anyone who believes that this theory is not the true theory of proletarian revolution, but that it has to be supplanted by Trotskyism in order to become such, then he must state openly and straightforwardly what alterations he thinks should be made. Is there really something anti-revolutionary in the teachings of Bolshevism on the revolution? Then the works issued by Lenin before the spring of 1917 must not be made the scientific authority on proletarian struggle and proletarian strategy against the bourgeoisie. Or we must at least say, but the art of realizing proletarian revolution is not to be learned from Lenin's works up to 1917, but from Trotsky's work since 1905. The October Revolution was either accomplished beneath the banner of uncorrected Leninism, or it was accomplished beneath the banner of Trotskyism and its correction of Leninism. Here we are at a parting of the ways. It was to be expected that Comrade Trotsky, in order to grant a certain amount of satisfaction to the party which he has thus benefited, should willingly admit that he has committed certain organizational errors in the past. What does such an acknowledgement cost when it serves as a cloak for the unpunished assertion that Bolshevism, Leninism, contains anti-revolutionary features? Paris is worth a mass. If one can appropriate the role of intellectual and theoretical leader of Bolshevism in the October Revolution, it is worthwhile to admit to even considerable errors in the past. Trotsky, in his Lessons of October, actually does make such a confession to the party. Quote, "I have acknowledged my real and great organizational mistakes," he writes. But was the 15 years conflict between Lenin and the Bolsheviks on one side, and Trotskyism on the other, concerned with organizational questions? This is nonsense, and endeavored to distract from the point. The conflict was directly concerned with the fundamental questions of the revolution, with the mutual relations of the different classes during the revolution, with the question of permanent revolution, with Comrade Lenin's theory, and this is the question of the role played by the peasantry in the revolution, the question of the paths leading to socialism in an agrarian country, the question of the methods and conditions for the realization of the proletarian dictatorship in a country in which the peasant population preponderates. This is no contention on abstract formulas. The theory of permanent revolution is based upon a complete underestimation of the role played by the peasantry. It replies to one question only. It tells us how power cannot be seized or maintained under these conditions. Trotsky's viewpoint, summed up from a study of the Lessons of October, may be expressed as follows. Quote, "On the eve of the events of 1905, Lenin imparted a peculiar character to the Russian Revolution by the formula, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. But, as later developments showed, this formula had only significance for one stage on the way." Unquote. This is followed by a literary dissertation to the effect that this stage was a stage on the way to Trotsky's formula. and this is the actual intellectual kernel of all Trotsky's latest writings. Trotsky shuffles his Trotskyism beneath Leninism with the whole of the literary art and talent peculiar to him. This last book of his is not written for the whole party, but for the younger generation now growing up, for the youth who, within a year or two, will have to determine the destiny of the party. The aim of Trotsky's book, 1917, is to take revenge for the 12 years in which Lenin exposed Trotsky's wretched policy, to prove that the revolution confirms Trotsky's theory, and to poison the minds of the future leaders of the party, now studying in the communist universities, workers' faculties, colleges, etc., by this shuffling of Trotskyism into Leninism. We cannot permit this aim to be realized. In this book, 1917, Trotsky inveighs against Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rykov, and others. I shall deal further with this and with my own errors, but am of the opinion that the reproaches made in this book are not intended for us only. The names of Kamenev and Zinoviev are given, but Lenin is meant. The question of the fate of Bolshevism may be put in the following form. Lenin had an excellent theory, but the disciples of Lenin did not know how to apply it. They did not recognize the needs of the concrete situation. The formula was right, but it has been badly carried out by this or that Bolshevik. It is possible to put the question in this manner, but it can also be stated as follows. If we draw all the logical conclusions from the Leninist formula, we are bound to land in a bog. The formula itself is wrong, and this wrong formula has been employed logically correctly. In the first case, we have a justification of the Bolshevist theory and an indication of the errors of individual Bolsheviks, but in the second case, if we are told that Lenin's nearest disciples accepted his formula and landed in a bog through applying it literally, then we see, enlightened as we already are by Trotsky's assertion as to the anti-revolutionary features of Leninism, and by his statement that Trotsky's theory, and not Lenin's, has been, quote, completely confirmed, then we see that the blows struck are directed not against Kamenev and Zinoviev alone, but through them at Lenin's main formula. Lenin in April 1917. Is it true that Bolshevism, in order to solve the problems of the revolution, was obliged to withdraw from its past? Is it true that the theory of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry proved inadequate? What were the actual facts, and how were these regarded by Lenin? What really happened, as seen by Lenin as well as by us, was that the Bolshevist idea of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry was fully and completely realized in the Russian Revolution, and after its realization began to develop into the Bolshevist idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I here take the opportunity of referring to one of the works in which Lenin laid down his principles at that time, Letters on Tactics, in which he comments on and explains to the party his famous theses of the 4th of April. Lenin writes, quote, "The revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry has already been realized in the Russian Revolution. The workers' and soldiers' Soviets are the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry as realized in actual life. We are still in the minority. We recognize the necessity of gaining the majority in these organs of the dictatorship." Unquote. If our theory has been realized, we must stride forward. How? In such manner that we gather together the proletarian elements of town and country against the petty bourgeois elements on the basis of the realized dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. This means the mustering and organization of the proletarian elements on the basis of this dictatorship in order to proceed from the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry to the dictatorship of the proletariat, to the purely socialist revolution. For this reason, Lenin invariably adapted his tactics to the development of the mass movement in the peasantry, and he studied the peculiarity of the realization of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, which consisted of the fact that the latter, at the given stage of the revolution, April 1917, retained their confidence in the bourgeois government in the form of defense of native country. After describing the views of the Bolsheviks contending against him, and I was one of these, and after a sharp attack upon us, Lenin writes, quote, "A Marxist must never quit the firm ground of the analysis of class relations. The bourgeoisie is in power. And is the mass of the peasantry not another bourgeoisie belonging to another stratum, of another description and character? Does it follow that this stratum may not seize power by the consummation of bourgeois democratic revolution? Why should this not be possible? Old Bolsheviks frequently judge in this manner." Unquote. I replied, this is perfectly possible. It is possible that the peasantry seizes the whole of the land and at the same time the whole power. Lenin continues, if the whole peasantry ceases to support the government in the social revolutionary and Menshevist Soviets, if the peasantry, having deserted the bourgeoisie, seize the land and power in spite of the bourgeoisie, then we shall have a new stage in the bourgeois democratic revolution. and one which will occupy us greatly." Unquote. This is much more complicated than Trotsky's theory, straight as the line which the crow flies. For Trotsky, with his slogan of "off with the Tsar and on with the labor government," the matter was much simpler. He simply ignored the whole peasantry and the conditions prerequisite to the realization of the dictatorship of the proletariat in a capitalistically backward, agrarian country. The greatness of Lenin lies in the fact that he began to carry out the dictatorship of the proletariat under the given conditions of a given agrarian country, and actually did carry this out by means of constantly keeping in sight those real elements upon whose foundation this dictatorship can not only be proclaimed but built up. As a matter of fact, even in April, it was not possible to judge whether there might not be a moment in the Russian Revolution in which the peasantry would leave the social revolutionary and Menshevist Soviets in the lurch and turn against the provisional government before it could attain to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin, as real politician and mass leader, knowing that we pursued the policy of the proletariat under the peculiar conditions of an agrarian country, arranged his tactics for both possibilities. Lenin would not have been Lenin, that is, he would not have been the practical leader of millions in class war if he had really taken over Trotsky's equipment, for Trotsky's theory would have inevitably led to the breakdown of the proletariat and of the peasantry as well. In its pure form, the line taken by Trotsky is simply the ignoring of the peasantry, the ignoring of that transition stage during which the peasantry still places its confidence in the ruling bourgeoisie at first, is disappointed and turns against the bourgeoisie, but still does not join the proletariat. This transitional stage, which ends by the proletariat taking over the leadership of the peasantry in the form of peasants' risings, realizing the dictatorship, and endeavoring to bring about an alliance between workers and peasants in various and changing forms. Lenin, in the same pamphlet in which he wrote against the old Bolsheviks, states, quote, "In my theses I have secured myself against any leaps over agrarian or petty bourgeois movements which have not yet been overcome, against any playing with seizure of power by a labor government. Trotskyism's down with the Tsar, up with the labor government is wrong. The petty bourgeoisie," Kamenev adds, that is, the peasantry, "exists and it cannot be ignored." Unquote. Is this not the literal repetition, in the heat of revolution, of all that Lenin had long warned the party against? In 1910, Lenin had already said that, quote, "Trotsky's fundamental error is the lack of the smallest thought about the question of the transition from this, the bourgeois revolution, to a socialist revolution." Unquote. Trotsky's, quote, "original theory takes from the Bolsheviks the demand for decisive revolutionary struggle on the part of the proletariat and the demand for the seizure of political power. From the Mensheviks, it takes the denial of the role played by the peasantry. Trotsky did not, however, reflect that when the proletariat induces the non-proletarian masses of the peasantry to confiscate the land of the landowners and to overthrow the monarchy, the, quote, "national bourgeois revolution" in Russia is achieved, and that this becomes a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Lenin criticized severely those comrades, including me, who had not observed that the revolution had already passed from one phase to another. He feared most that progress would be hindered by the parties falling into the rut of Trotsky's abstract theory, and again he accuses it of wanting to spring over the peasants' movement before this was in our hands. There was no need for Lenin to change his equipment. The old Leninist theory, the old Leninist, Bolshevist conception of the character of the Russian Revolution and of the relations between proletariat and peasantry were seen by Lenin to have proved fully correct. And now we had to advance further on the same lines. But the greatest care must be taken, in this advance, not to fall into Trotsky's mistaken footsteps. 12 years before 1917, Lenin had prophesied that, after the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry had been realized, we should have to advance to the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that this advance must take the peasantry into consideration, and must create conditions under which the peasantry cooperate with the proletariat, without simply ignoring the peasantry, as Trotsky proposes. Bolshevism does not need to borrow weapons from the arsenal of Trotskyism. At the same time, there were some Bolsheviks who did not advance so rapidly from stage to stage as was required by the tremendous acceleration of the revolution caused by the enormous pressure of the war. But this does not in the least signify that Bolshevism was on the wrong track, that it led into a bog instead of to victory, or that it had to be altered during the revolution. And this is just what Trotsky is trying to prove. Trotsky has never grasped the essentials of the Leninist theory on the relations between the working class and the peasantry in the Russian Revolution. Even after October he didn't grasp it, and he didn't grasp it when our party applied it in fresh ways, or when our party successfully maneuvered for the realization of the dictatorship of the proletariat without separation from the peasantry. His own theory, which in his opinion has proved entirely right, has prevented him from grasping the Bolshevist position. If Trotsky's theory had proved correct, this would signify that the Soviet power would long since have ceased to exist. This theory of permanent revolution, which does not trouble about the peasantry or provide any solution for the question of the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, renders the labor government in Russia absolutely dependent upon the immediate proletarian revolution in the West. According to this theory, the proletariat, after having taken over power, is plunged into the most hopeless contradictions. Its power is limited by objective social difficulties. Quoting Trotsky's 1905, their solution is prevented by the economic backwardness of the country. Within the confines of a national revolution, there is no means of escape from this contradiction. Unquote. Under such conditions, a delay or postponement of the proletarian world revolution would have inevitably caused the immediate collapse of the workers' dictatorship in Russia. Thus, the adherents of the permanent revolution are bound to pass through stages of despair and profoundest pessimism to attempts at overcoming the economic backwardness of the country by force with the aid of military commands. Real Bolshevist policy, as pursued by Lenin from February to October, has nothing in common with either this policy or this psychology. How did matters really stand in October and immediately afterwards? Seen from the standpoint of Marxism, from the standpoint of the analysis of the class forces of the revolution, was not the acceptance of the social revolutionary decree on landed property, the supplementation of the Soviet government by the left SRs, the designation of the government created by the October Revolution as workers' and peasants' government, all proposals of Lenin, was all this not a growing development of the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry into a system whose actual essence was already the dictatorship of the proletariat? It is possible to omit some of these facts of the October Revolution, but there we do not arrive at any scientific analysis of Lenin's policy. And what about the transition from war communism to the new economic policy, from the committees for the impoverished peasantry to Lenin's speech on the medium farmers? How can this be brought into harmony with that theory of permanent revolution, which has proved so, quote, perfectly correct? In 1916, Lenin wrote that life was already a decade ahead of Trotsky's magnificent theory. Now, we can add another 8 years. Does the circumstance that life has passed Trotsky's theory by for 8 years justify Trotsky in claiming to be able to correct Leninism by Trotskyism? Since life has passed Trotsky's theory by, Trotsky attempts in his books to not only correct Leninism, but life as well, and to prove by every art of which he is master that life follows Trotsky after all. It is incumbent on the party to show precisely the contrary, and to prove to not only Trotsky but every new member the necessity of Bolshevizing Trotsky. How far has the party succeeded in this? Section 3. Trotsky and the Party. Our Errors. October according to Trotsky. We must differentiate between two aspects of Trotsky's activity. The one aspect is Comrade Trotsky as he carried out the instructions of the party strictly and accurately, leaning with the other members of the party on the totality of common political experience in the party and on the whole party mass organization, and carrying out this or that task or command of the party. At this time, Comrade Trotsky's deeds were splendid, and added many brilliant pages to his own history and to that of the party. But since Comrade Trotsky has come forward as an individualist, believing that he, and not the party, is in the right in the fundamental questions of revolution, and that Leninism must be improved by Trotskyism, we are obliged to see that other aspect of Comrade Trotsky, which shows him to be no Bolshevik. 4 attempts made by Comrade Trotsky at improving the party. The party remembers 4 occasions upon which Comrade Trotsky has tried to instruct the party, and to force upon it his own Trotskyist deviations. The first occasion was a few months after Comrade Trotsky entered the party. It was at the time of Brest-Litovsk. The party is adequately and accurately informed as to Comrade Trotsky's attitude at that time. He underestimated the role played by the peasantry and covered this over by revolutionary phraseology. This was the road to the defeat of the proletariat and the revolution. If we recollect the evidence brought at this time against Comrade Trotsky by Comrade Lenin, we see that Comrade Lenin brought no other evidence than the substantiation with which he had rejected Comrade Trotsky's general attitude during the course of the preceding decade. Comrade Lenin reproached him with 2 political sins: lack of comprehension for the relations between proletariat and peasantry, and liability to be carried away by apparently left, apparently revolutionary phrases. These 2 errors, typical of Comrade Trotsky whilst outside of our party, were repeated by him within it. Then came the Civil War, the epic of war communism. Comrade Trotsky executed the task allotted to him. His participation in the direction of the general policy of the party was less than before, but now the revolution reached a fresh turning point. The relations between the classes shifted. The party anticipated, in the form of a discussion on trade unions, the question submitted a few weeks later at Kronstadt, the question of the transition from war communism to the new economic policy. What was Comrade Lenin seeking for at that time? He was seeking new forms for an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, new forms for leading the working masses by means of gaining their convinced adherence rather than by force. To what did Comrade Trotsky look for salvation at that time? He advised us to tighten the screws of war communism. This was again and again an underestimation of the peasantry, the liability to be carried away by externals, by methods of pressure and administration from above. And Comrade Trotsky's further attempts, even during Comrade Lenin's lifetime, the question of the plan according to his peculiar conception, his formulas on the dictatorship of industry, were not these again attempts to force petty bourgeois mentality upon us from above with bonds of iron? Did they not once more show that lack of comprehension of those concrete conditions under which it is alone possible to realize a dictatorship in an agrarian country with undermined industries at a time when the international revolution is retarded? Beneath Comrade Trotsky's effective formulas, we can here easily distinguish the feelings inevitably involved by his original theory. On the one hand, despair, pessimism, disbelief, and on the other hand, exaggerated hopes in the methods of supreme administration, to use a term of Lenin's, in the competent subjection of economic difficulties from above. The last discussion is still fresh in our memories. It gave the party a graphic survey of the totality of Comrade Trotsky's errors as dealt with above, but it also showed with special clearness another error, another feature of Trotskyism, and one far from being new. This is the attempt to undermine and weaken the main framework of the dictatorship, the party. The same object was aimed at by the discrediting of the cadres of the party, by the resurrected Menshevist conception of the party as a collection of, quote, groups and currents, and the essentially liquidatory undermining of the authority of the leading institutions, quote, they are leading the country to destruction. And has it not been under Comrade Trotsky's banner that the idea of greater freedom from party influence for extra-party organizations has flourished? Has not all this, taken together, led to a weakening of the dictatorship of the proletariat? And has it not all been based upon an underestimation of the conditions under which we, in an agrarian country, have to realize the dictatorship? Is it not a petty bourgeois deviation? So long as the party is perfectly sound and everything goes well, Comrade Trotsky quietly performs every task which falls to him. But as soon as the party encounters any obstacle, as soon as it has to adjust its rudder, and Comrade Trotsky at once springs forward in the role of savior and teacher of the party, but invariably points out the wrong way, since he has not absorbed the principles of Bolshevism. Our errors. Comrade Trotsky has another trump in his hand against Bolshevism. This trump consists of certain errors committed by some few Bolsheviks, above all by me and Zinoviev, then those of Rykov and Nogin, in October 1917. The errors of the Bolsheviks are naturally invariably exploited by our enemies. Comrade Trotsky did not resort to this trump so long as he hoped to induce the party to deviate to the path of Trotskyism by means of the discussion of this or that practical question. But after 4 attempts, Brest, trade unions, discussion on the economic plan, and the last discussion, had shown him that he cannot persuade the Bolshevist party to deviate from its path. After he had learned from the party at the 13th Party Conference that we, the Leninists, do not require our theory to be corrected by Trotskyism, then he brought forward this last trump. He is of course not the first to do this. These errors have been exploited often enough already by our enemies, but both errors and exploitation were simply buried beneath the thunders of the proletarian revolution. At the time, neither the errors themselves nor their being made use of by hostile quarters resulted in any practical consequences. It is only since then that these errors have been raked up again maliciously by those who had deserted communism. Levi, Frossard, Balabanova. Levi and Frossard are now being followed by Trotsky. Vacillations were unallowable. Lenin armed himself against them with all the power and passion of a leader who sees that his co-workers are liable to carry confusion into their own ranks by vacillation at decisive moments. He exposed every vacillation relentlessly, and in critical and decisive moments he did not shrink from the severest words or propositions. And he was right to the end, without reservation. But when the moment for calm discussion arrived, the moment for the avoidance of the repetition of similar errors in other communist parties, then Lenin characterized these errors very accurately. When Sarati attempted to cloak his withdrawal from communism by these errors of Zinoviev and Kamenev, Comrade Lenin wrote, quote, "Before the October Revolution in Russia, and immediately after it, a number of excellent communists committed errors which we do not like to remember now. Why do we not like to remember them? Because it is wrong to call to mind errors which have been made perfectly good, unless there is some special reason for doing so." Unquote. Special attention must be accorded to the manner in which Lenin formulated our errors. Quote, "In the period of which I speak, they vacillated, fearing that the Bolsheviks were isolating themselves, were rushing too recklessly into a rising, were too unwilling to meet the advances of a certain section of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. This conflict went so far that the comrades named resigned demonstratively from all responsible positions both in the party and in Soviet work, to the great joy of the enemies of the Soviet Revolution. The affair culminated in a very severe criticism in the press on the part of the CC of our party against the resigning comrades, and after a few weeks, at latest after a few months, all these comrades recognized their error and returned to their responsible party and Soviet positions." Unquote. Is this description of Lenin's any way similar to the malicious attempt made by Trotsky, ridiculous in its malice, to twist this right wing into an actually Menshevist wing in the Bolshevist party? But this appears to be Comrade Trotsky's fate. In order to attain his object, he is invariably obliged to overcome Lenin, Leninism, and the Leninists. Trotsky writes again about himself and Lenin. Were we the only ones, in Trotsky's opinion, who made mistakes at the time of the October Revolution? No, we were not the only ones. This book contains many sensations, but the most sensational sentence in the book is one referring to the October Revolution. On page 50 of his Lessons, Trotsky writes, quote, "The rising on the 25th of October was of supplementary character only." Unquote. There are probably many here present who took part in the October events, and these will be surprised to learn, 8 years after the 25th of October 1917, that the rising on the 25th of October was merely of a supplementary character. What did it supplement? We learn that it supplemented the events which had taken place on the 9th of October. The main data of the revolution are familiar to us, but when I mention events which occurred on 9th October, many will ask what happened on that date, to which the October Rising was nothing more than a supplement. On the 9th of October, says Comrade Trotsky's book, a resolution was passed in the Petrograd Soviet, on the motion of Comrade Trotsky, ending with the sentence, quote, "The Petrograd Workers' and Soldiers' Soviet cannot be responsible to the army for such strategy on the part of the provisional government, and especially for the removal of troops from Petrograd." Unquote. It need not be said that this was an important resolution. It united the garrison, which didn't want to go to the front, with the Petrograd Soviet. But listen to how Comrade Trotsky describes and estimates this event on the 9th of October. Quote, "From this moment onwards, we were actually in a state of armed insurrection. The issue of the rising on the 25th of October was already 3 parts predetermined at this moment. In all essentials, an armed insurrection had already been brought about. Here we had a, quote, quiet and, quote, almost legal armed insurrection, one which was 2/3, if not 9/10, an accomplished fact. From this moment onwards, we had a victorious rising in the capital city." Unquote. Thus it appears that the 25th of October was not more than a slight supplement to the Great Ninth. But now the question arises, if the victorious insurrection was already an accomplished fact to the extent of 9/10 on the 9th of October, what are we to think of the mental capacity of those who sat in the Bolshevist CC and decided in a heated debate on 10th October whether we should proceed to an insurrection or not, and if so, what then? What are we to think of people who on the 15th of October gathered together as the plenary session of the CC together with the functionaries and co-workers from the military organizations, and still deliberated on the prospects of the insurrection, on the forces of the insurrection, and on the date of the insurrection? Had it not all been arranged on the 9th quietly and legally? So quietly that neither the party nor the CC heard anything about it. But this is merely a side issue. What is the party? What is the Petrograd Committee or the CC when Trotsky writes a history of the October Revolution? In this history, neither the CC nor the party exist at all as real living powers, as collective organizers of the mass movement. And there's not a word to be learned from the lessons of October with regard to what took place in Moscow, that not only in Petrograd, but in Moscow and Ivanovo-Voznesensk, there was a proletariat which was also doing something. And with reference to Lenin, the book informs us, quote, "Lenin, who was not in Petrograd, did not fully estimate the importance of this fact. Lenin, living illegally, had no possibility of estimating the thorough upheaval," unquote, etc. We see that not one of us really knew anything about the October Revolution. We had thought that it was precisely Lenin who led the October Revolution, and that the CC The party and the military organizations of the party organized it, but it appears that they did not appear on the scene at all. In order to throw even more light on the part played by Lenin, Trotsky reports as follows, quote, "If the insurrection had begun in Moscow," and Kamenev adds, "in accordance with Lenin's advice, before the revolution in Petrograd, it would inevitably have dragged much more, and the issue would have been very doubtful, and a failure in Moscow would have had a very severe effect upon Petrograd," unquote. Whilst Lenin is engaged in imparting such advice, Trotsky, with his, quote, "quiet but victorious insurrection already in his pocket," is executing, quote, "an extensive maneuver." Quote, "We succeeded," he writes triumphantly, "in luring our enemies into the trap of Soviet legality," unquote. Lenin, calculating much more upon the workers, sailors, and soldiers than upon Comrade Trotsky's maneuvers, wrote at this time, quote, "It is a cringe to hesitate. It is a piece of childishness and formality to wait for the Soviet Congress, a betrayal of the revolution," unquote. But Trotsky refutes Lenin's words with an air of victory at the close of his description of the roles played by him and by Lenin in October. Quote, "It is one thing to organize an armed insurrection under the bare slogan of seizure of power by the party," Trotsky instructs Lenin, "but it is something very different to prepare and realize an insurrection under the slogan of the defense of the rights of the Soviet Congress," unquote. Here the figures are shifted from their actual positions. Lenin is illegal, unable to make a correct estimate of the situation, omits to observe that 9/10 of the insurrection has already been completed, advises that the rising be commenced in Moscow, although this obviously condemns the revolution to failure. Trotsky, on the other hand, brings about a victorious insurrection by the 9th of October, carries out a definite but cautious maneuver by which he lured the enemy into a trap, and, quote, "prepares and realizes the victory under a slogan comprehensible to the broad masses, the slogan of defense of the rights of the Soviet Congress." What do these lessons of October endeavor to teach us? That in the spring, Lenin was obliged to alter his attitude, to abandon his old theory, and to borrow weapons from Trotsky, equipment, and that in October, Lenin endeavored unsuccessfully to lead the insurrection which Comrade Trotsky was destined to lead to victory. We have to choose what we are to learn and to teach, either this history of October, this history of Trotsky's, or the history as given in the works of Lenin. In the question of the Constituent Assembly, Comrade Trotsky quotes my and Zinoviev's letter of 11th October, in which we wrote, quote, "The Constituent Assembly will be able to lean upon the Soviets only for aid in its revolutionary work. The Constituent Assembly and the Soviet form the combined type of state institutions toward which we are advancing," unquote. Trotsky comments as follows, quote, "It is extremely interesting for the characterization of the whole line adopted by the right to note that the theory of, quote, combined state institutions uniting the Constituent Assembly with the Soviets is one which was repeated 1 or 2 years later in Germany by Rudolf Hilferding, an opponent of seizure of power by the proletariat," unquote. Zinoviev's and my letter was written on the 11th of October, and I take Lenin's article, written on the 6th of October. Lenin writes as follows, quote, "During the transition from old to new, combined types are possible at times, as the Workers' Path rightly pointed out a few days ago. For instance, Soviet Republic and Constituent Assembly," unquote. What does this imply? It implies that in the case before us, Lenin resembled Hilferding. Historical truth is of little importance to Trotsky. The alteration of tactics at moments when the situation alters from day to day is of no interest to him. What interests him is to discredit Bolshevism by every possible means. A final example, again in 2 words. In this same letter of October 1917, we wrote, quote, "These masses of the soldiery are not supporting us for the sake of the slogan of war, but for the slogan of peace. Should we find ourselves in a position, after seizing power, in which the international situation obliges us to resort to a revolutionary war, the soldiery will turn away from us. The best of the youth among the soldiers will remain true to us, but the great mass will leave us," unquote. The historian may judge in how far this estimate was justified, but what does Comrade Trotsky do? He writes, quote, "Here we see fundamental arguments in favor of the signing of the Brest-Litovsk peace," unquote. Thus it appears that the Brest-Litovsk peace, signed by the party on the urging and iron pressure of Lenin against Trotsky, was substantiated by, quote, "fundamental arguments supplied by us, the, quote, right, the followers of Hilferding. It is not to be wondered at when our enemies, who have a very fine feeling for anything wrong, comment on such books about Lenin by remarking that it is difficult to distinguish whether they have been written by a co-worker or a rival of Lenin." Leninism against Trotskyism. The results may now be summed up. We are the monopoly party in our country. We gather together in our ranks every organized worker in the country, but we must not forget for a moment that we are surrounded by elements foreign to our class, and that these elementary forces do not diminish, but will multiply and become politically more enlightened. They do not possess the form of legal organization. Petty bourgeois intelligence will also grow on the soil provided by the development of industry, of the works and factories, and of trade. All these petty bourgeois elements, finding no open means of expression in any social organization, are naturally endeavoring to further their aims through the medium of our party itself. These petty bourgeois elements, in exercising this pressure upon our party, naturally seek the weakest link in the chain, and as naturally they find this weakest link where people have entered the party without being assimilated to it, and are possessed by a secret conviction, leaving them no peace, that they are more in the right than the party is, and that it is mere narrow-mindedness on the part of the party, mere conservatism, tradition, and adherence to this or that clique in leading positions, which prevents the party from learning from its real saviors, such as Comrade Trotsky. Commenting, that should sound really familiar to anyone familiar with Trotskyism. Fast forward to the 1930s, when Stalin is leading the fight against Trotskyism, and the whole petty bourgeois revisionist push at that time, basically bourgeois ideas seeking expression within the party, since that's really the only outlet for any kind of organized political expression, it's exactly what Kamenev just described here. So let's read that again. The results may now be summed up. We are the monopoly party in our country. We gather together in our ranks every organized worker in the country, but we must not forget for a moment that we are surrounded by elements foreign to our class, and that these elementary forces do not diminish, but will multiply and become politically more enlightened. They do not possess the form of legal organization. Petty bourgeois intelligence will also grow on the soil provided by the development of industry, of the works and factories, and of trade. All these petty bourgeois elements, finding no open means of expression in any social organization, are naturally endeavoring to further their aims through the medium of our party itself. Again, it being the only medium available. The petty bourgeois elements, in exercising this pressure upon our party, naturally seek the weakest link in the chain, and as naturally they find this weakest link where people have entered the party without being assimilated to it. And so we're just talking about Trotsky being in the Bolshevik party, but not really a Bolshevik, bringing in Menshevist ideas and refusing to renounce them fully, and continuing attacks on Lenin. And, these are somewhat cloaked attacks that do require a fairly high degree of historical and theoretical literacy in order to be able to spot them and what is wrong with them. But they're there, and that's really the point of a lot of this second part, that Trotsky in the party is still doing Trotskyism, which is different from and not compatible with Leninism. It's hostile to it, and he's trying in his works to overwrite Leninism by supplanting it with his ideas. So again, people not assimilated into the party, he definitely is referring to Trotsky here. And what he's saying we can extrapolate here into the future is that this sort of weak link is going to be a rallying point and a beacon for trying to establish more of a petty bourgeois line within the party. I mean, they just want to establish it within the country, but the party is really the only place, the only forum in which to establish anything. And so if you can't get rid of this weak link within the party, it's going to be the undoing. It's going to be the entry point for the revisionists seeking to attack the party from within, which really is the only organized way that they can attack the party. Anyway, continuing, these people, entering the party without being assimilated to it, remain possessed by a secret conviction, leaving them no peace, that they are more in the right than the party. And again, this is Trotsky as described above. As Kamenev said, when Trotsky was in sync with the party, carrying out its orders and basically being a servant of the revolution, that was great, however short-lived it may have been. But then on multiple occasions, Trotsky kept trying to supplant Leninism with something else. And it was a consistent pattern. So if you're in this society and you have petty bourgeois ideas and you want to get them realized, well, okay, the proletarian revolution is triumphing for now. But why not take this secret conviction, this contradiction that you have with the party that, you just can't get out of your head. You really want to fight for petty bourgeois interests. Well, go to the leader, the person who is, highest ranking and displaying these tendencies. And this is what you've got here. So anyway, having this secret conviction that you are more in the right than the party and that it is mere narrow-mindedness on the part of the party, mere conservatism, tradition, and adherence to this or that clique in leading positions, which prevents the party from learning from its real saviors, such as Comrade Trotsky. And so that's the end of that section. And basically, This is what every Trotskyist says about the ensuing struggle that Trotsky waged to take control of the party. I mean, it's really uncanny. Anyway, continuing. It is with great regret that I state this, and the whole party will echo this regret, but it has to be said. Comrade Trotsky has become the channel through which the elementary forces of the petty bourgeoisie find their way into our party. The whole character of his advances and his whole historical past show this to be the case. In his contentions against the party, he has already become a symbol all over the country for everything directed against our party. This is a fact which it is most important for Comrade Trotsky to grasp. If he will grasp this and draw the necessary conclusions, then everything can be made good again. Comment, in other words, if that's not what Trotsky's trying to do, then he needs to learn these lessons immediately and change course, because this is what's happening. Continuing, whether he wants it or not, and assuredly he does not want it, right? Please say you don't want it. He has become, for all who regard communism as their greatest enemy, a symbol for emancipation from the thrall of the Communist Party. Comment, this is true today, and it's why I think there are so many Trotskyist groups in the UK, in the US, and to this day, if you put just like Trotsky Stalin into a lot of search engines, you will get very sympathetic bourgeois narratives about how Trotsky almost saved the USSR from Stalin and blah, 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 which is really kind of a curious narrative to describe somebody who really should be the archenemy of capitalism and would be putting capitalism out of business permanently, etc. Continuing, this is the regrettable but perfectly inevitable conclusion of all who are accustomed to judge political events from the standpoint of actual analysis of class relations, and not from the standpoint of mere words. I am aware that in Moscow, a city particularly receptive for all manners of rumors, quote, perfectly reliable information, is already being spread abroad to the effect that firstly, Comrade Trotsky's book has been prohibited, and secondly, that Trotsky's exclusion from the party is contemplated, and Trotsky himself is no longer in Moscow. All this is naturally mere gossip. It has not occurred to anybody to prohibit Comrade Trotsky's book. No single member of the CC has raised the question of any reprisals against Comrade Trotsky. Reprisals, expulsion, and the like would not enlighten anybody, but would on the contrary render enlightenment more difficult and at the same time give opportunities to those brewers of confusion who would like to sow the seeds of schism in the party and prevent the real fundamentals of Bolshevism being explained in their differentiation from Trotskyism. And it is this explanation which is of fundamental importance at present. It must be perfectly clear to every conscious member of the party that for us, the Bolsheviks, and for the international proletariat marching forward to victory, Leninism is sufficient, and that it is not necessary to substitute or improve Leninism by Trotskyism. And so that's the end of the audiobook. This was met with enthusiastic applause at the conference. In closing, I'll just add one more thought. There was a video a year or two ago which went up on the Finnish Bolshevik channel, which speculated on some of the causes or origins of Khrushchevite modern revisionism. And the video title or the thumbnail or something said something along the lines of like, was Khrushchev a Trotskyist? And a lot of people I saw comments online didn't really know what to make of that, or they didn't see the connection directly between Khrushchev and Trotsky. But I think that it's in this light that something like that should be understood. If we understand revisionism to be the entry of bourgeois ideas into the communist vanguard, then we have to ask, how do they get into the party? How do they get into the vanguard? Who's letting them in? Where's the breach in the hull? Where's the chink in the armor where these things are slipping in? And so the argument that this disguised Menshevism posing as Bolshevism is basically that entry point. Every country engaged in revolutionary struggle will have their own Trotsky, their own Mensheviks, etc. But it's basically this idea, the concealed liberalism hiding behind revolutionary phrases that actually in practice amounts to right policies and stances. That is, so to speak, the open window during the blizzard. And in this case, it really does take a high degree of theoretical and historical literacy to be able to identify it as such and to prevent it from leaking all of these anti-revolutionary, anti-proletarian ideas into the party and to, thereby prevent them from being embraced by the party. Trotskyism has been described as the advanced detachment of the bourgeoisie. It is one of their more sophisticated weapons, and this is its purpose, to undermine Leninism while claiming to defend it. And so we have to study to understand it and to uproot it when we confront it during the course of our struggles. All right, we're going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for a few dollars a month or more. Everything is encouraging. It's also materially helpful, and it allows me to spend more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.